You know, when we think about colonial education, it's easy to just picture old schools and universities. But in British India, it was so much more than that. It wasn't just about teaching reading and writing. It was a full-on, deliberate blueprint for control. So today, let's unpack how that blueprint was designed and the long shadow it still casts. I mean, just think about that for a second. It's a huge, strategic puzzle. How does a tiny group of foreign administrators possibly govern a massive, sprawling subcontinent like India? You definitely can't do it with force alone. You're going to need a much smarter and way more subtle tool.
And there it is. That's the answer they landed on. The British figured out that education could be an incredibly powerful weapon. If you control what people learn, how they think, and what they value, well, you can shape a population that actually helps you run your empire for you.
Right, so the British needed a way to run the whole show. They needed a massive bureaucracy. We're talking clerks, tax collectors, low-level administrators to keep the whole enterprise going. And for that, they needed a very specific kind of Indian, someone who could act as a bridge between the British rulers and the millions of people they ruled. Yeah, let's be super clear about this. The point was never universal literacy or encouraging critical thinking across the board. Nope. The primary goal was to basically manufacture a class of people who would become the clerks, the civil servants, the intermediaries, the essential cogs in the colonial machine.
So how'd they actually build this thing? Well, it wasn't overnight. Through a series of very intentional policy moves, they began to systematically take apart India's own rich educational traditions and replace them with a brand new model, designed in Britain for Britain.
It started kind of small, back in 1813, with the Charter Act, which set aside the first bit of money. But the real absolute game changer was Macaulay's Minute in 1835. This made English the language of power and education, pretty much locking out anyone who didn't speak it. Then Wood's Despatch in 1854 cemented the whole thing, creating the big universities that would pump out loyal subjects for decades.
And wow, this quote right here says it all. You can't get much clearer than that. Lord Macaulay wasn't hiding the ball. The goal was to create a proxy ruling class, people who looked Indian on the outside but were completely English on the inside. This wasn't some accidental byproduct. This was the mission statement.
So what was the strategy? They actually had a name for it, the downward filtration theory. It's kind of what it sounds like. Instead of trying to educate everybody, they decided to focus only on a tiny upper crust of society. The hope, or at least the official line, was that these Western ideas and values would just magically trickle down to everyone else. Spoilers, it didn't really work that way.
And we have to understand, this wasn't just a simple update to the curriculum. This was a complete and total replacement. Before the British, you had this incredibly diverse system with institutions teaching everything from philosophy to medicine in local languages. That was all pushed aside, labeled inferior, and replaced with a one-size-fits-all system focused on English and a Western curriculum.
Okay, so what did this grand experiment in social engineering actually produce? What kind of society did this blueprint end up building?
Well, from their perspective, the system worked like a charm. It created a brand new English-speaking elite that was, just as planned, pretty disconnected from the rest of the population. It poured resources into universities while ignoring primary schools and villages, and of course, it churned out that perfect workforce of clerks and administrators needed to keep the wheels of the empire turning smoothly.
But, and this is where the whole story gets really interesting, there was a massive flaw in the blueprint. A system designed for total control accidentally planted the seeds of its own downfall. So, did it all go according to plan? In the long run, absolutely not. The British handed over a very specific set of tools, thinking they could control how those tools were used. Turns out, they were very, very wrong. Here's the incredible irony. While this new educated class was studying British literature and history, they were also reading about things like liberty, democracy, and equality. And they started asking a very logical question. Hey, if these ideas are so great for Britain, why aren't they for us? English, the language meant to ensure loyalty, suddenly became the language that united nationalist leaders from every corner of the country against the empire.
So the British Empire is long gone, but that educational framework they built, well, it casts a very long shadow, one that India is still dealing with to this very day.
And it's a really complex, messy legacy. On the one hand, yes, it set up modern universities and introduced modern science. And English is still a really important language for business and communication. But on the other hand, it created these massive class divides, dismissed centuries of local knowledge, and drilled in this mindset that Western automatically meant better.
And this is not just ancient history, you guys. This tension is happening right now. You can see it in huge policy debates, like India's recent national education policy. A lot of that is a direct attempt to finally decolonize the system, to promote learning in local languages and bring traditional Indian knowledge back into the classroom. It's about stepping out of that colonial shadow.
It all leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? The story of what happened in India is this powerful case study of how systems of knowledge are also systems of power. And it kind of forces us to look around and ask, in our own lives, in our own countries, how much of what we're taught is still being shaped by someone else's blueprint?